A fighter pilot was declared dead 7 years ago. Her family mourned. The military held a memorial. But she was alive, living in shadows under a false name, conducting secret missions nobody would ever know about. Then one day, on a commercial flight, everything changed. Catastrophic failure. 189 lives hanging in the balance. She had one impossible choice: stay hidden and let everyone die, or reveal herself and lose everything forever. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The memorial service took place on a gray October morning 7 years ago, and it rained the way rain always does at military funerals, heavy and unforgiving. Major Sarah Chen's name was read aloud by a colonel with a practiced voice, the kind of voice that had delivered too many of these speeches. Her family sat in the front row, her mother with hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her younger brother with his jaw clenched in that particular way men clench their jaws when they're trying not to cry, her father staring at a folded American flag as though it might explain something. The flag would never explain anything. Sarah had been a fighter pilot, the kind that other pilots talked about in whispers between flights, not because of arrogance, but because of the peculiar competence that some people carried, like they'd been born knowing how to read sky and wind and the precise mathematics of controlled chaos. She'd flown combat missions in theaters the news only partially covered, places where the desert looked the same in every direction and the enemy didn't always wear a uniform. She'd been classified Operation Good, the kind of pilot who had 3 confirmed kills and half a dozen more that never made it into any report because the missions themselves were buried under layers of secrecy. Her instructors had noted in classified files that she possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate aircraft behavior, to sense structural stress before instruments registered it, to make split-second decisions that turned impossible situations into survivable ones. 7 years ago, on a Tuesday that nobody would have predicted would change everything, her fighter jet had been shot down over hostile territory during a classified operation that would never be declassified, at least not in her lifetime. The search and rescue team found wreckage scattered across 40 square miles of unforgiving desert landscape. They found blood on the ejection seat, still wet enough to suggest recent trauma. They found charred equipment with serial numbers that matched her aircraft perfectly. They searched for 72 hours straight through scorching heat and treacherous terrain, working with the kind of desperation that came from searching for one of their own. They found no sign of her body, no personal effects, no indication that she'd survived beyond the initial ejection. Eventually, the military concluded what seemed most probable: she'd ejected successfully, survived the impact, but hadn't made it far enough before the insurgent forces in the region had found her. The official record said she was killed in action, murdered by hostile combatants. The memorial wall in Arlington carried her name in bronze. Her family had received the folded flag, and with it, the lifetime burden of grief. What the memorial service didn't know, what nobody could know because the classified protocols were precise and absolute, was that Sarah had indeed ejected. She had survived the impact with a compound fracture in her left arm and a concussion that made the world spin in nauseating circles. She had experienced the particular terror of lying in a ravine with hostile forces searching nearby, knowing that capture meant interrogation, that interrogation meant death. She had evaded capture for 6 agonizing days and nights, using every survival technique the military had taught her, rationing water, hiding during daylight hours, moving only under cover of darkness. By the 3rd day, a wound in her side had become infected, and fever had made coherent thought nearly impossible. She was hallucinating, delirious, barely conscious when the CIA extraction team found her in a ravine at dawn on the 7th day. They'd taken her to a hospital that didn't officially exist, in a country that wasn't officially involved in the conflict, and they'd explained her choices with the clarity of people who'd been authorized to be very frank about matters of national security. She could go home, they'd said. She could reclaim her identity, but her survival would complicate intelligence operations that were still ongoing. There were people in the region, high-value intelligence assets and targets of significant interest, who had been told she was dead, and her reappearance would compromise years of carefully constructed work. There were operations that depended on the collective belief that she had died in the crash. Going home meant compromising those operations. Going home meant putting other lives at risk, agents in the field, foreign assets that had provided critical intelligence, infrastructure that had taken decades to build. Going home meant betraying the sacrifice of people she would never know. Or she could stay dead. She could accept a new identity, new documentation, a completely fabricated life history that would withstand any background check. She could work as a classified operative conducting intelligence missions that prevented terrorist attacks, destabilized hostile networks, and shaped geopolitical outcomes in ways that no public record would ever acknowledge. She could spend years in countries where she wouldn't have a name, where she would exist in the shadows, doing work that nobody would ever credit her for, waiting for a day that might never come when she could try to reclaim her real life. She could become a ghost, invisible and untouchable, existing in the spaces between official reality and classified operations. Sarah had chosen to become a ghost. It was the only choice that made sense given the circumstances, though it was also the choice that would cost her everything. For 7 years, she'd lived as Margaret Walsh, a geological consultant who traveled frequently to developing nations for work that nobody asked too many questions about. Her face had been changed slightly through procedures that left no records, subtle alterations to bone structure that changed her appearance without making her unrecognizable to herself. Her accent had been neutralized through exercises that took months of daily practice. Her fingerprints had been altered through a procedure both painful and irreversible, one that she'd endured in a medical facility in Eastern Europe with only a handler present. She lived in apartments that were always temporary, furnished with items chosen to create no emotional attachments. She maintained bank accounts under her false name and paid taxes on income that came from shell corporations. She learned to cook different cuisines, to appreciate different wines, to speak 3 additional languages well enough to pass as a native speaker. She never, under any circumstances, attempted to contact her family. She never searched for them on social media. She never allowed herself the luxury of watching from a distance. She'd been present at an embassy in Jakarta when a terrorist cell had tried to firebomb the compound, and she'd identified the operatives before they could execute the attack. She'd prevented a coup in a Central African nation by identifying a weapons shipment before it arrived at the capital, information that allowed the government to intercept the arms and arrest the conspirators. She'd posed as an arms dealer in a hotel in Moscow, sitting across from men who sold weapons to organizations that killed innocents, gathering intelligence that would eventually lead to sanctions and military action. She'd tracked financing networks that supplied insurgent groups, identified terrorist cells before they could execute attacks, prevented bombings and assassinations and coups. She'd done 17 major missions that had changed outcomes in ways that only a handful of classified briefing rooms would ever know about. She'd been good at being dead. The psychological cost of living as a dead woman was not something the classified briefing documents had predicted with accuracy. The agency had provided her with a therapist who was cleared to know her situation and signed contracts that made them legally bound to secrecy, contracts with penalties that included prison time if violated. That therapist had explained that her symptoms were normal, that the dissociation and the nightmares and the strange moments where she'd catch her reflection and not immediately recognize the face were all expected responses to her situation. The therapist had warned her about depression, about the particular isolation that came from being unable to share her true life with anyone, about the existential weight of living under a false identity. Nothing unusual about a woman losing herself in order to serve her country. Nothing unusual about watching the years pass while the people she loved aged and changed and lived lives she could never be part of. Nothing unusual at all. Margaret Walsh boarded United Flight 447 on a Tuesday in November, 7 years and 1 month after Sarah Chen's name was added to Arlington's memorial wall. She carried a Canadian passport with an authentic-looking wear pattern, wore glasses she didn't need, and had dyed her hair a shade of brown that wasn't quite natural but close enough. She was assigned a seat in 14C, middle seat, which meant she'd have a conversation-preventing shoulder pressed against either an armrest or a stranger the entire flight. She'd learned to prefer middle seats, they were less likely to attract conversation, and they provided a psychological buffer between her false identity and curious seatmates. She was scheduled to land in Sao Paulo 8 hours and 45 minutes later, but before that, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, she was supposed to make contact with a target aboard the flight. Not a target in the assassination sense, the agency didn't actually do that anymore, or at least not officially, and certainly not with someone like Sarah. The target was a man named Viktor Kozlov, supposedly a Russian businessman but actually an intelligence asset who'd switched allegiances 6 months ago and was now carrying information that the CIA wanted delivered to a safe house in Sao Paulo. Sarah was supposed to verify that he had the information, ensure his safe transport through Brazilian customs, and then disappear back into her Margaret Walsh life as though nothing had happened. It was a routine extraction operation, the kind she'd performed dozens of times. Simple. Low risk, professional. Victor was in seat 8B, first class, which meant she wouldn't approach him until the flight reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had been turned off. Sarah took her seat, declined the beverage service, and tried to read a novel that she wasn't actually processing. The woman next to her, seat 14B, was a traveling businesswoman in her 50s who seemed to have a chronic cough and kept apologizing for it. Sarah assured her it was no problem, which was technically true, though she'd learned to find small talk exhausting after years of living undercover. Every conversation had the potential to require a lie, and she'd grown tired of lying to people who'd done nothing to deserve it. She'd become adept at being present without being engaged, at existing alongside people without forming connections. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 2:47 p.m. precisely. It was a Boeing 777-300ER, built 12 years ago with a solid safety record and a complement of 189 passengers plus crew. The flight was scheduled to take 8 hours and 45 minutes with standard routing. Sarah had made this flight before, or rather, Margaret Walsh had. She knew the routing, the typical turbulence patterns over the Atlantic, and the fact that the airline usually served a mediocre pasta in business class around hour 4. She'd flown this route 3 times in her cover identity, each time uneventful, each time allowing her to practice the art of disappearing in plain sight among hundreds of strangers. The first sign that something was wrong came 45 minutes into the flight, right after they'd reached cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. It was subtle, a small shudder that most passengers wouldn't have noticed, the kind of turbulence that was common enough in the Atlantic corridor that the flight attendants didn't even look up from their jumped seats. Sarah, though, had a training that included understanding how aircraft felt when their integrity was compromised. She'd flown jets that had been damaged by hostile fire and still performed, jets that had limped back to base with hydraulic fluid leaking and one engine operating at reduced capacity. She'd learned the almost imperceptible language of aircraft in distress, the micro-vibrations that preceded system failures, the particular quality of sound that indicated structural stress. She unclipped her seatbelt and moved to the lavatory, positioning herself where she could see into the cockpit briefly as a flight attendant opened the galley door to prepare for the drink service. The captain was already on the radio, his voice clipped and controlled in a way that suggested he was working through a checklist. Sarah's heart rate elevated slightly. She'd learned to recognize the vocal patterns of pilots confronting emergencies. She'd returned to her seat and waited. 20 minutes later, the captain made an announcement. There appeared to be an anomaly in one of the hydraulic systems, he explained in that calculated way pilots used when they didn't want to create panic. They were performing diagnostics and working through the appropriate procedures. There was no immediate danger, but as a precaution, they were going to begin a gradual descent toward the nearest available airport, which was Gander International in Newfoundland. His tone was reassuring, professional, practiced. Sarah had heard similar announcements before. Sometimes they preceded minor mechanical repairs. Sometimes they preceded something worse. Sarah had learned that situations could escalate very quickly, or they could simmer for hours before things got truly bad. She'd been in aircraft where a single mechanical failure had been catastrophic, and she'd been in aircraft where system upon system had failed redundantly without producing a true emergency. She stayed calm and waited for the next sign. The businesswoman next to her gripped the armrest and asked if this was normal. Sarah assured her it was, which was technically accurate. Aircraft systems did fail. Diversions did happen. Most of them ended with everyone walking off the plane without incident. It came 40 minutes later, when the aircraft suddenly pitched nose down by approximately 8 degrees in what felt like an uncontrolled descent. The oxygen masks dropped automatically from the compartments above. People screamed. A coffee pot broke in the galley, spraying hot liquid across the floor. Several passengers unbuckled their seatbelts in panic, standing up before the aircraft stabilized. The captain announced, with slightly less control in his voice this time, that they'd experienced a momentary loss of pressure in the primary hydraulic system but had recovered it. They were now diverting to Gander with urgent priority. His voice no longer sounded practiced. It sounded concerned. Sarah helped the businesswoman next to her with her oxygen mask, which the woman had partially dislodged in her panic. The aircraft stabilized, though she could feel a slight tremor in the controls that suggested all was not well. The captain made another announcement, this one briefer, stating that they had regained control and were beginning the descent sequence for Gander. Sarah looked at the flight attendant's face as she passed and saw something in it that made her understand, with absolute clarity, that the situation was worse than it sounded. The flight attendant's smile had a quality of desperation to it, the particular desperation of someone trying to pretend that everything was fine while simultaneously making peace with a possible outcome that wasn't fine at all. It wasn't until hour 3 of the emergency that Sarah understood how bad it actually was. The primary hydraulic system had failed completely. The secondary system was now failing as well. The aircraft's landing gear mechanism, which relied on hydraulic pressure, was not responding to electrical backup systems. The engines, specifically the number 2 engine, were beginning to show signs of damage, possibly from the same incident that had destroyed the hydraulic systems. The captain, working with the first officer and with engineers on the ground, was attempting to figure out whether the aircraft could be landed safely without operational landing gear using alternate control methods. The answer was becoming increasingly clear, probably not. Not using standard commercial procedures. Sarah had moved to the back of the aircraft, ostensibly to use the rear lavatory but actually to position herself where she could observe the galley crew and think clearly about what she was observing. She sat in an empty jump seat in the galley area, and a flight attendant didn't stop her because the normal rules of operation had effectively been suspended when the situation became critical. The crew was working on a problem that had no obvious solution, and Sarah's presence in the galley seemed like the least of anyone's concerns. The flight attendants were preparing for an emergency evacuation. They were mentally preparing for the possibility that this flight would not end successfully. She ran through the physics of the situation mentally, using the training that had been drilled into her over 12 years of military aviation. A 777 without landing gear would require an extremely shallow landing angle, too steep, and the aircraft would break apart on impact. The fuselage would scrape the runway first, the friction would generate catastrophic forces, the structural integrity would fail, and 189 people would experience the particular horror of controlled chaos becoming uncontrolled chaos at high speeds. The aircraft would break apart in sections. There would be explosions. People would die trapped in their seats or crushed by debris or burned by fires. It would be a catastrophe visible from space. But there might be a way. There was a way that pilots executed in extreme situations, a way that required absolute precision and control and knowledge of the aircraft's capabilities at angles of attack that commercial aviation training didn't typically cover because commercial pilots weren't expected to land 400-ton aircraft without landing gear on a runway. It was a military technique, one that had been developed and refined over decades of combat aviation. It had been executed maybe a dozen times in history. Most of those times, it had worked. Some of those times, it hadn't. It required military flying skills. It required someone who understood the aircraft at a level that went beyond standard training. Sarah sat in the galley and considered her options with the clarity of someone who had spent 7 years accepting impossible choices. She could remain as Margaret Walsh. She could allow the aircraft to attempt whatever landing procedure the captain and the flight engineers thought was best, which would likely fail catastrophically. She could die under her assumed identity, her real identity staying dead, her family never knowing that she'd been alive all these years. She could preserve her cover, preserve her mission, preserve the 17 classified operations she'd conducted for the agency. She could take her secrets to her grave. Or she could sacrifice all of that. She could walk into the cockpit and offer expertise that a Canadian geological consultant had no business possessing. She could guide the aircraft down using techniques that would immediately identify her as someone who was not who she claimed to be. She could save 189 people by destroying everything she'd sacrificed 7 years to create. She could choose to be dead no longer. Sarah stood up slowly. She adjusted the false glasses she wore. She took a moment to press her hand against the side of the aircraft and feel it, the weight of metal and fuel and electricity and the desperate lives of almost 200 people suspended in the sky. She felt the vibration of the engines, the subtle oscillation of a system struggling to maintain altitude. Then she walked forward toward the cockpit with a decision that would change everything. A flight attendant put out her hand. "I'm sorry, you can't go up there right now. We're preparing for." "I know," Sarah said. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of someone who'd made a decision. "But I need to speak with the captain. Immediately. Tell him I have military aviation experience, and I think I can help with the landing procedure. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him I was a fighter pilot." The flight attendant's expression cycled through disbelief, irritation, and then something that might have been desperate hope. She knocked on the cockpit door. When it opened by the first officer, who looked exhausted in a way that suggested he'd already accepted some version of a worst-case scenario, she gestured toward Sarah. Sarah stepped into the cockpit, and when the captain turned to look at her, he had the expression of someone beyond politeness or protocol. "Who are you?" "My name is Margaret Walsh," Sarah said, which was technically true, even if it wasn't her original name. "But I was a fighter pilot, U.S. Air Force, retired. I understand you have a landing situation that's gone beyond standard procedures. I understand you're looking at options and coming up empty." The captain was a man in his 60s with gray at his temples and eyes that had already seen too many things. "We do. And I appreciate the offer, but civilian advice about military aviation isn't." "I'm not offering advice," Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on the authority of someone who'd spent years giving orders to other pilots. "I'm offering to guide you through a tactical landing procedure that relies on extreme precision control and understanding how the aircraft will respond to inputs at unusual angles of attack. You don't have landing gear. The runway at Gander is 10,000 feet long and 200 feet wide. You have roughly 45 minutes of fuel remaining. Standard procedures won't work. You know that. I can feel it in your voice." The first officer, younger, maybe 40, stepped forward. "What's your name again?" "Margaret," Sarah said. "And I'm telling you that there is a way to land this aircraft without landing gear if you're willing to execute a procedure that requires military-level precision. I can talk you through it. I can sit right seat and work through the inputs with you. But you have to decide right now whether you trust me, because we're running out of time to implement this, and if we're going to try, we need to start preparing immediately." The captain looked at her for a long moment. He studied her face. He listened to her voice. He made a decision that would save lives or end them. "Sit down. Tell me about this procedure." Sarah moved into the right seat, displacing the first officer, who didn't argue. She'd worked in the right seat of a fighter jet for 12 years. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never stopped missing. "The key," she began, her voice dropping into the technical register of someone explaining complex physics to people who understood what the words meant, "is understanding that at a certain angle of attack, approximately 2.5 to 3.5 degrees, the aircraft's aerodynamic profile changes in a way that lets us use control surfaces to maintain directional and pitch stability even without landing gear. We're going to bring the nose up slightly, which will slow the aircraft to approximately 110 knots. We're going to approach at a very shallow angle. When we make contact with the runway, we're going to rely on the fuselage to provide the initial friction and absorb the impact. That's going to destroy the aircraft," the first officer said. His voice carried the weight of understanding what was being suggested. Probably, Sarah agreed without hesitation. But not as completely as a standard landing attempt would. The fuselage is built to withstand significant stress. It can be rebuilt. The people can't. If we try a standard landing without gear, the nose will catch and the aircraft will cartwheel. Everyone dies. If we do this my way, we might lose the aircraft, but we save the people. The captain was already making calculations on the flight management system. We'd need to communicate this with air traffic control, with the ground crews at Gander. Tell them we're attempting an emergency landing procedure for an aircraft with inoperable landing gear, Sarah said. Tell them we've made contact with an aviation specialist who believes the approach is feasible. They'll understand what that means. They'll know the procedure. The first officer was running through calculations on the flight management system. If we approach at 2.8 degrees and maintain 110 knots, we'll touch down somewhere around marker 3000 on the runway. That gives us 7,000 feet to decelerate. Plenty of space, Sarah said. We'll deploy the air brakes at touchdown, reverse thrust, deploy the emergency brakes. The fuselage will lose structural integrity in sections, there will be damage, but the momentum will dissipate through the fuselage absorbing the impact rather than the passengers absorbing a crash. People will be injured. But people will survive. The captain picked up the radio. Gander, United 447. We have a situation to communicate regarding our landing procedure. What happened over the next 45 minutes was a sequence of calculations and preparations and the particular kind of focus that emergency situations generated. Sarah walked the captain through the approach angle inputs, the precise timing for reducing throttle, the exact moment when they would transition from airborne to making contact with the runway. She helped him understand how the aircraft would respond to control inputs at angles that commercial training didn't typically cover. She explained the aerodynamics in language that was technical but clear. The first officer worked with ground engineers, explaining the procedure and dealing with the stunned silence that greeted the announcement. There was a version of this procedure used in military contexts, though rarely, a last resort technique for aircraft that had exhausted other options. That it was being attempted on a civilian aircraft with 189 passengers was unprecedented. At ground level, emergency response teams were staging along the runway. Fire trucks, rescue vehicles, ambulances, the entire apparatus of crisis management was being positioned. They were told to expect a high-impact landing on the fuselage. They were told to prepare for a possible evacuation while the aircraft was still at high speed. They were told that they might be assisting with one of the largest disaster responses in Canadian aviation history. Sarah stayed in the right seat as they descended through 15,000 feet. She could feel the aircraft's weight, could sense the balance point where a slight correction in the control inputs would mean the difference between a survivable landing and catastrophe. She'd done this in her F-16 during training exercises, practice runs where the stakes were theoretical. Now the stakes were 189 actual human beings. At 5,000 feet, she said to the captain, "You're going to be steady. You're not going to second-guess the angle. Trust the inputs we've calculated. Trust the aircraft. Trust yourself." "I trust them," the captain said. His voice was steady. He'd been flying for 35 years. He'd handled emergencies before. But this was different. This was beyond the scope of commercial aviation training. At 2,000 feet, Sarah walked him through the final sequence. The airspeed was 115 knots, which was slightly faster than ideal but within acceptable parameters. The angle of attack was holding at 2.8 degrees. The landing gear warning light was illuminated on the panel, a reminder of the absence below. "Reversing thrust on my mark," the captain said. His hands were steady on the controls. 3. 2.1, mark. The engines transitioned to reverse thrust. The aircraft began to slow. Sarah watched the altitude indicator with the intensity of someone who understood exactly how much was at stake. 500 feet, 300 feet, 150 feet. They were committed now. There was no going around, no second attempt. This was the moment where physics and training met reality. "Contact," the captain said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who just accomplished something impossible. The fuselage touched the runway at precisely the calculated angle. The friction was immediate and violent. The aircraft shook with a force that sent a tremor through Sarah's entire body. She heard the sound of structural failure, not catastrophic, but significant. Metal protesting against concrete, systems shutting down automatically as they were designed to. Sparks visible through the window as the fuselage generated friction against the runway. But the aircraft didn't break apart. The impact was distributed through the fuselage in the way Sarah had calculated. The passengers, restrained in their seats, experienced the violent deceleration but not a crash. It was painful. It was terrifying. But it was survivable. "Air brakes," the captain commanded. "Deployed," the first officer confirmed. The aircraft slowed. 100 knots, 0.80 knots, 0.60 knots. The end of the runway was approaching, but they were slowing fast enough. Sarah watched the runway disappear beneath the nose of the aircraft. They were going to come to a complete stop on the tarmac. "Reverse thrust," the captain said. "Cut it." The engines went silent except for the sound of air still moving over the fuselage. The aircraft rolled forward on its belly, slowing more and more, until finally, after what felt like much longer than the actual 38 seconds it took, they came to a complete stop approximately 1,200 feet from the end of the runway. There was absolute silence in the cockpit. Then the radio crackled. "United 447, we show you have stopped on the runway. Confirm you have secure landing." The captain swallowed. He looked at Sarah with an expression of something approaching disbelief. He picked up the radio. "Gander, United 447. We are secure. We have 189 souls on board. Requesting immediate emergency response and evacuation procedures." Sarah unclipped her seatbelt. She stood slowly. Her hands were shaking slightly, though her face remained neutral. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, and she was confronting what her choice meant. The first officer was already working through the post-landing procedures, communicating with the cabin crew about evacuation. "Thank you," the captain said quietly. His eyes were glistening. Sarah nodded. She didn't say anything. There wasn't really anything to say. She'd sacrificed everything in those 45 minutes. Her cover was destroyed. Her mission was compromised. Her 7 years of living as dead were over. She walked back into the cabin. The emergency lights had come online, casting everything in a strange twilight. Passengers were already unbuckling seatbelts, standing slowly, some in shock, some crying, some laughing with the particular hysteria of people who'd confronted their mortality and survived. The flight attendants were opening emergency exits, deploying slides. Someone was shouting instructions about orderly evacuation. The smell of burned fuselage and emergency foam filled the cabin. Sarah moved with the flow of passengers toward an emergency exit. She was only halfway down the evacuation slide when she heard the commotion beginning in the terminal, the emergency response protocols activating, the beginning of the chaotic coordination that would follow any landing like this one. She was on the tarmac, moving away from the aircraft with the other passengers, when she first saw him. Viktor Kozlov, the man she was supposed to verify and transport. He was holding his arm, which was bleeding from a cut, but he was mobile. He looked at her, and his expression changed in the way that betrayed recognition, not of who she was, but of something being off about her. He'd been briefed about who his contact would be. He'd been told to expect Margaret Walsh, a geological consultant from Canada. But something about the way she'd survived this landing, the way she'd moved through the emergency with a confidence that didn't match her cover identity, had triggered his professional instincts. He looked away quickly. The protocol was broken. The mission was compromised. It was broken further 2 minutes later, when military personnel arrived on the tarmac, not Canadian military, but American military. They emerged from vehicles with an efficiency that suggested they'd been pre-positioned, waiting for just such a contingency. A senior officer approached Sarah before the other passengers, moved her away from the crowd with a gentleness that contrasted with the gravity of the situation, and said quietly, "Major Chen. Welcome back to the land of the living. We need you to come with us." Sarah's cover had been exposed. Her real name was spoken aloud on the tarmac at Gander International Airport in front of emergency response personnel and other passengers and flight crew. The name she'd been declared dead under was being used to identify a living woman. The silence of 7 years was broken. She didn't resist. She understood the protocols. She understood that the moment she'd gone into the cockpit and demonstrated military-level flying expertise, the mathematics of her situation had shifted completely. Her cover was destroyed. Her mission was ended. 7 years of living as dead had been surrendered to save 189 people. In the hours that followed, there would be debriefings. There would be military intelligence officers asking questions about how she came to be on that aircraft, why she was traveling under false documentation, what her classified operations had entailed. There would be security protocols activated. There would be decisions made at levels of government that she would never be briefed on. There would be bureaucratic machinery set in motion, the machinery of correcting official records, of explaining her survival, of processing her return from the dead. But in that moment, walking across the tarmac with the smell of aviation fuel and burned metal and emergency foam in the air, Sarah Chen allowed herself to think about what came next. Her mother was still alive. Her brother was still alive. They'd mourned her 7 years ago and moved on, the way people eventually do. They'd learned to live with the absence, to accept her death as part of their family's story. Now they would have to confront the fact that they'd buried a ghost, that the daughter and sister they'd grieved had been alive the entire time, living in places and doing things they would never be told about. The reunion wouldn't be simple. 7 years was a long time to be dead. Identity wasn't something that could be quickly reclaimed. The woman Sarah had been before the crash was gone, transformed by trauma and survival and the peculiar demands of classified service. The woman she was now, looking back at the aircraft she'd just successfully landed on its belly, was someone new entirely. She had skills that didn't match her supposed civilian background. She had memories that couldn't be shared. She had knowledge that was classified. She would be forever separated from the normal world by the secrets she carried. But she was alive. She'd chosen to be alive. And that choice had saved 189 people. That choice meant that 189 people would return home to their families. That choice meant that children would grow up with their parents, that spouses would grow old together, that lives would continue on paths they'd expected to follow. As the officer guided her toward the waiting vehicle, Sarah looked back one more time at the aircraft. The fuselage was damaged but intact. Emergency personnel were continuing the evacuation, but the panic was becoming order, the crisis was becoming response. She'd done that. She'd made the choice to break cover and save strangers, and it had worked. The mathematics of sacrifice and redemption had been executed perfectly. She got in the vehicle. The door closed. She didn't look back again. In the weeks that followed, there would be public statements about heroism and the civilian passenger who helped save a flight. Her real name would be withheld from media reports for security reasons, but the story would circulate in aviation circles and military culture, the legendary pilot who'd returned from the dead to prevent disaster. News outlets would speculate about her identity. Aviation forums would debate the procedure she'd used. Her actions would become part of aviation lore, studied in flight schools and discussed by pilots around the world. The family would eventually be contacted and told the truth, though the full extent of her classified operations would remain hidden even from them. They would be brought to a secure facility and debriefed carefully, told that Sarah had survived her crash 7 years ago but been unable to contact them due to operational security concerns. They would struggle to reconcile the sister and daughter they'd mourned with the woman who returned to them, older, harder, carrying secrets that would never be shared. They would learn to know her again, slowly, carefully, understanding that 7 years was not something that could be erased. Sarah would be offered various options regarding her future: positions in military aviation, positions in defense contracting, positions in intelligence. She would go through psychological evaluations and security reviews. She would spend weeks in debriefings, telling and retelling the story of her survival, her time underground, her classified operations. She would begin the long process of reclaiming a life that had been stolen from her, knowing that the woman who would live that life was not the woman who'd left it 7 years before. The memorial wall in Arlington would have to be amended. The official records would have to be corrected. The story would have to be rewritten. But on the tarmac at Gander International, in the immediate aftermath of the landing, all Sarah Chin knew was that she'd made a choice, the choice to sacrifice the cover that had kept her alive, in exchange for keeping 189 other people alive as well. She'd been dead for 7 years. Now she was alive again. And though there would be costs to that resurrection, costs she couldn't yet fully comprehend, costs that would reshape her understanding of who she was and what she'd given up, in that moment, watching the aircraft she'd just saved being attended to by emergency crews, she felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. She felt like herself. For the first time since the crash, since the extraction, since she'd chosen to become a ghost, Sarah Chin felt like a real person with a real identity and a real choice in the matter of her own life. The choice had cost her everything. The choice had saved everyone. And in the strange calculus of heroism and sacrifice, that was the only mathematics that mattered. 3 months later, Sarah sat in a coffee shop in Arlington, Virginia, watching the afternoon light filter through the windows. She was no longer Margaret Walsh. The false identity had been officially retired, sealed in classified files that would remain classified for decades. She was Sarah Chin again, or at least, that's what her passport said. But the woman looking back at her from the mirror was someone in between, someone who'd lived 2 lives and couldn't quite decide which one was real. The news had gone public eventually, of course. It had been impossible to contain. The story of the dead pilot who'd returned to save a commercial flight had captured something in the public imagination, the mythology of resurrection, of sacrifice, of someone choosing to give up everything for strangers. News outlets called her a hero. Military analysts debated the landing procedure. Aviation schools added video of her emergency landing to their curriculum. She'd been invited to speak to Congress. She'd been offered a book deal. She'd been offered movie rights. She'd turned down most of it. What she'd accepted was a quiet job as a consultant for the FAA, helping them understand emergency procedures and training pilots for situations that commercial aviation hoped would never occur. It kept her busy. It kept her connected to flying without requiring her to actually pilot an aircraft. She'd learned that her hands still trembled slightly when she thought about taking the controls of a commercial jet, that the weight of 189 lives had left an impression on her that wouldn't fade. Her mother had been waiting for her when she'd been released from the debriefing facilities. 7 years of grief had transformed her mother's face into something lined and careful, but when she'd opened the door to the safe house where they'd arranged to meet, her mother's expression had cycled through shock and disbelief and then something raw and fundamental, a mother looking at her daughter and trying to reconcile the ghost with the living woman standing in front of her. They hadn't known what to say to each other at first. 7 years was a long time. They'd aged separately, lived completely different lives, developed into different versions of themselves. But they'd also shared something that couldn't be undone, the fact that they'd both survived the same impossible circumstance, just in different ways. Her mother had survived the grief. Sarah had survived the exile. They were learning to know each other again. It was slow work. Sarah couldn't talk about most of what she'd done during her 7 years as Margaret Walsh. There were things that would remain classified forever, things that her family would never be cleared to know. But there were other things, small moments, inconsequential memories, that she could share. And gradually, through these small sharings, a version of their relationship was being reconstructed. Her brother had been harder to reach. He'd been angry when he found out, but he was coming around slowly. Her family was trying to understand, and that was enough for now. The military had offered her a promotion, but she'd turned it down. She didn't know if she could fly combat missions again. She was learning to live as a civilian, which was turning out to be more difficult than living as a classified operative. She was learning to sit in coffee shops and read novels without analyzing the crowd for threats. She was learning to sleep without waking from nightmares. She was learning to live with the knowledge that she'd done something extraordinary. The public saw a hero, but Sarah knew the true cost of her choice. After 7 years of living as a ghost, she was finally learning to be real again. The coffee had gone cold while she'd been lost in thought. Sarah took a sip anyway, grimacing at the temperature. Through the window, she watched people walking past, ordinary people living ordinary lives, people who'd never had to choose between their identity and their humanity, people who'd never been declared dead and forced to continue living in the shadows. She envied them, sometimes. And sometimes, she was grateful for who she'd become, grateful for the experiences that had transformed her into someone capable of making impossible choices. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah finished her cold coffee and gathered her things. She had dinner plans with her mother tonight, nothing fancy, just a quiet meal at her mother's house. It would be a little awkward, like all their meals still were. But it would also be real, and that was what mattered. After 7 years of living as a ghost, Sarah Chen was learning the value of being real.